Dear Capcom, it's time for a new classic Resident Evil game. You've had success with the big budget titles for so long. Village was huge, RE2 Remake was huge, RE4 is massive. You've had action-focused titles and slow brooding horror experiences and pure survival horror focused games. Resident Evil can do anything at this point. That's why you need to go back to the classics. I am asking, on behalf of many old school fans, that you put a small talented team on a new project focused on mid-budget Resident Evil games. I'm not saying that you should give up on the new games, absolutely not. They're cash cows, they're successful, they're well received. I love them as much as anyone else. Well, really only RE2 Remake and RE4. But their existence does not mean that every game has to be like this. Look at the Metroid series. We have first-person shooters and we have 2D platformers. We have 3D Mario games and we have 2D Mario games, and they both do great. Resident Evil is capable of this too. People like to talk about how those old Resident Evil games are dated and only the modern ones are playable, but Resident Evil became the powerhouse it is today because of the originals. There may be some dated and unnecessarily clunky aspects about them, just as there are in any old game, but it doesn't mean the overall design is bad or irrelevant. Resident Evil 1 changed the world. RE2 is still one of the highest selling horror games of all time. Millions of fans adore the original games, and many new fans have come to love them too, as they've been introduced to them through YouTube channels that advocate for them. The GameCube remake of RE1 is still to this day considered by many fans, old and new, to be the best in the series. You gave it an HD makeover with the remastered release in 2015, and people loved it. Almost 5 million copies sold on PlayStation 3 and Steam, with a bunch more sold on the newer consoles. All in the past 8 years. You cannot say that there's no audience for these classic fixed camera games, and you cannot say that no one who didn't grow up with the original games can get into this style of gameplay and camera. So I'm asking for a small team to use the RE1 remake as their inspiration and craft a slow, spooky exploration and puzzle-focused adventure with survival-based combat and resource management and a light amount of action. Make a new old Resident Evil game with a grounded story, no teleporting villains or opera singers psychically controlling leeches. None of that. Just a simple bioweapons evil corporation story with a fun twist. Price it at $30 and it'll sell like fucking hotcakes. You could even launch a whole side series off this. You know it's true. If indie titles like Tormented Souls and Signalis can move a few 100,000 copies, just imagine what an old school official Resident Evil could do. But now that I've mentioned other new old school titles, that brings me to how this game should look and control. There's two ways to go about it, in my opinion. You could do what Tormented Souls did, fully 3D environment with a hybrid camera system. Sometimes the camera follows your character as they're moving towards it or away from it. Sometimes it's fixed, but it turns on its axis to follow you like a security camera. And sometimes it's a classic static angle that doesn't move. I'm a huge fan of static angles because of their cinematography. I did a whole video on the top 25 angles of the Resident Evil trilogy. Please check that out if you've ever wondered why people like this camera style so much. So I, of course, would prefer to see an entire game made exactly like the classics, static angles only. And let me tell you why. It's not just because I'm a fan of that presentation. It's also because of the realistic graphics that become possible. The reason why the original Resident Evil in 1996 ended up going with this static camera system was because it allowed them to have higher quality character models and create a world that felt more real, due to the PlayStation's power not having to process the environment. 3D games looked like this, and they didn't think they could create something genuinely scary under those graphical limitations. Now, the PlayStation did eventually go on to do some impressive stuff with Metal Gear Solid and Silent Hill, but that's 3 to 4 years into the console's life and developers understood the technology better. This happened with the Resident Evil sequels as well. Just look at how much better the character models look as the series goes on. But the static camera style had already been established by the first title, and the gameplay was designed around it, so it continued. Every environment was actually a painting, a static image, with the characters and key items placed against them at the appropriate angle to create the illusion of a 3D space. And it worked incredibly well, especially since these games were played on old 90s CRT televisions at 320p resolution. The RE1 GameCube remake really shows us the power of this technique by continuing to use painted backgrounds, now higher definition for a new console, with all the processing power going into the character models and effects, which made the RE1 remake look wildly better than anything else coming out on the console, or any other console at the time. This is what other GameCube titles looked like in 2002, so you can clearly see the benefits that static painted backgrounds have. The game still looks phenomenal 20 years later. Imagine a new classic Resident Evil with static painted backgrounds in 4K, photorealistic environments, with all the modern graphics processing being dedicated to only the character models, lighting effects, and interactable objects. We could have the protagonist and monsters looking so lifelike that it really would be like we're looking at a movie. And since our consoles don't have to run anything other than these few elements, you could release this on last-gen consoles and still have it look amazing. It wouldn't matter how powerful your PC was, you would be able to play it and it would look incredible even at low settings. That's my case for static angles and painted backgrounds. That's what I personally want. But you could also go with 3D backgrounds and a hybrid camera system like Tormented Souls. You just need to make sure you have some static angles in there to capture the classic feel. In both cases, you can offer two types of control: full modern analog stick controls or tank controls. When I play Tormented Souls, I go back and forth, and they make both styles work really well. A bigger question than the controls is character movement. Should you be locked in place while aiming, or should you be able to move? I think maybe allow for a small amount of movement while you're aiming, and that's it. We don't need to be running around blasting away. This isn't Doom. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say on camera and controls. Additionally, I'd like to see a variety of difficulty settings, with the higher ones implementing old school ink ribbon only saves. I want replay options like unlockable weapons, but also difficulty modifiers like making monsters deadlier, limiting resources, mixing up puzzle solutions, just a bunch of stuff to keep it fun. Capcom, listen to me. You have a golden opportunity here. It's time to jump on it. And I'll be expecting a thank you in the credits. Forever yours, Mayo.